And for this next session, looking at a year in review, when working with our partners at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, we wanted to assure that the conversation went beyond just the federal government. So the Indo-Pacific Strategy and the one-year anniversary is a timestamp for the discussion. It's not a definition of the subject matter. What we want to have this afternoon is a discussion on how all of Canada engages. So how is academia engaging? And academia just stepped on stage. How is the private sector engaging? Private sector just stepped up on stage. And how are other actors, such as the civil society and think tanks, engaging? And we have Canada's standard bearer for think tanks in the region, Asia-Pacific Foundation, who will hopefully be taking our role next year, returning to the co-organizer role next year. So Jeff, I just put you on the spot for... Don't worry about it. It's fine. You're okay. So I'll turn it over to Sven Litz from EDC Canada. And again, we'd like to thank EDC for their ongoing support for Canadians engaged in the Indo-Pacific. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sven.
Thank you very much for those kind introductory words. Just to position everybody on stage and in online. So online with us today is Lynette Ong, professor from the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, apologies. Then I have Jeremy Paltiel, senior fellow of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, joining us. Next to him, we've got Trevor Kennedy, Vice President, Trade and International Policy from the Business Council of Canada. And to the left of his, Kim Nossal, Professor Emeritus from Queen's University. And all the way down the line, Jeff Nankivell, President and CEO of the Asia-Pacific Foundation. So the topic for today is the IPS a year in review. And we'll jump right into this exciting topic and have an open, engaged conversation. I know that this morning there were some very open conversations about where we're at, what needs to change, and we'll keep that theme going. And to kick us off, I'm going to pass it over to Lynette. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about where you see the Indo-Pacific strategy the first year in, and just to make it interesting, if you were to give it a grade 1 year into it, what would that be? Over to you, Lynette.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sven. And, you know, it's good to be with you, and I apologize that, and I wish I could be with you in person. But I think if I could say something, never ask a professor to give a grade, right? Because we are professors, we are used to giving grades, which probably doesn't mean anything. But if I were to give a grade, I would probably give it a B. The reason is, I think the Indo-Pacific strategy, to me, is a positioning paper, right? It's a very important paper that aligns Canada with the United States and is democratic partners in the Indo-Pacific based on values. It is also a paper that frames China as an increasingly disruptive global power. And it outlines our effort to counteract China by building on key multilateral arrangements in the Indo-Pacific. So it's a positioning paper and it's a framing paper. I think that on itself is very important, because for a long time the community has been waiting on a China paper, a China strategy paper from the government, and that has not been forthcoming. And this Indo-Pacific strategy brings all the partners together with China at the very center. So other than positioning and framing, I think with that we have articulated where we want to go. So we have articulated where the destination is. But what the paper falls short on is, I think, the specific on how exactly we will get there. So are we going to take a train? Are we going to fly? Are we going to take a boat? Right? And I think the mode of transport is, or the mechanism through which we will get to our destination, I think there is a lack of specificity. I think overall the IPS language is compatible with that of the United States Indo-Pacific Strategy, which was released nine months earlier in February 2022. In the US version, China is seen as an emerging peer competitor to the United States, and one that undermines its vital interests and weakens the US-led alliance in the region. So there is seemingly coordination between the two countries in terms of our official stance against China. But Canada is actually excluded. Outside the IPS, Canada is excluded in various US-led initiatives and arrangements in the Indo-Pacific, which I think is hampering our capacity or the perception of our capacity to stand firm against China as we have framed it as an increasingly disruptive global power. And I'll talk about the achievement. I think to me, 1 year on since the release of the IPS, the greatest achievement to date is, I think, with the ASEAN countries. Canada's engagement with the regional institutions is elevation of Canada to a strategic partner alongside the US and the EU, which I think reflects ASEAN fundamental recognition of the benefits of trade engagements with Canada. And this is good news for Canada's relationship in the Indo-Pacific, because as a way of diversifying trade away from China, particularly in the agri-food sector with the ban of beef products, we are finding inroads into Indonesia and other ASEAN countries. And I was listening in on the trade session earlier. It's a lot of exciting things going on the trade sector, but focusing on the security side of things, I think there are things that we could do better. There's kind of room for improvement. Just briefly, Canada is not part of Quad or part of AUKUS, and even though these might be quite specific security alliance, which I will return to later in the second part of the session, but I would just say that symbolically being excluded by the US-led security unilateral arrangement in the Indo-Pacific, I think is symbolic of a bit of a marginalization, that we are standing on the side. We are not part of the Indo-Pacific region. I think that is not good. That is detrimental to the perceptions of Canada's capacity to deal with China in a way that we see China as an increasingly disruptive global power. So I will leave it here.
Thank you for that, Lynette. Maybe if we can build on that, Jeremy, I'll pass it over to you. So, what are your views? What are you perceiving in terms of the role of China in the IPS, but also to talk a little bit more broadly, because the Indo-Pacific is a very diverse region.
Thank you for that. I'm not going to disagree directly with my colleague,
but you can.
Lynette. Yeah, but no, as I see the IPS, it has two goals in tension. The first goal, I think Lynette said absolutely correctly, it is to more or less align Canada with our senior ally in our approach to China as a disruptive power. That's absolutely part of the IPS, even though many of you know the initial drafts of the IPS never mentioned the word China, and it was the will of the minister herself who inserted China into the thing. It was a kind of how to talk about China without naming it was the main approach, because that's partly due to the second goal intention of the IPS, which was to also reposition, to reinvigorate Canada's interest in Asia, and to do that, though, with this tension about how China should be perceived in this Asian thing. And so those two goals in tension mean that there are some contradictions in between the two of them. Part of it has to do with the fact that the IPS itself although it names China as a disruptive power, is pretty clear in not wanting to join a kind of Cold War or decoupling from China as part of it initially. And that is consistent with the goal of ASEAN centrality, which was certainly articulated by the minister in terms of that, and the idea of the ASEAN outreach. So that is to say, we wanted to say we are very much interested in Asia. We want to continue. We are very much a Pacific nation. We have some concerns about China. We actually don't want to necessarily exclude China from the region at the same time. And these are two goals in tension. And with that in mind, before giving you necessarily a grade, first of all, the fact that we have finally articulated a vision and the fact that we have refocused our government on an interest in Asia, that gets at least an A for effort. And all the events in the succeeding year would give us at least a C+, if not a B-. And then not all of that is our own fault. In that regard, I think part of it has to do with the geopolitics, the issues with India we're all aware of. We're not going to go over that. And part of it has to do by design. That's to say, how far can we get with this Asia focus if Asia's largest trading partner is is marginalized? That's a structural problem in the IPS. And a structural problem in the IPS too is the relationship between we want to be in Asia, we want to be there, we also want to align with the United States, which has its own particular tensions and reasons. There's very little we could do about that. The good news is that we're still trying to be out there, and we're doing our best to stay out there, and we're putting some real investment in it. The other aspects of it have, and also not only that investment, it has enabled certain things, better improving our partnerships with South Korea and Japan as part of this general alignment with the United States. Where we're not necessarily doing well is actually we've fallen short on this, in some ways, on trying to balance this recognition of China as a challenge with maintaining our relationship. Because the fact is that Canada has the worst relationship with China of any G7 nation, and has a worse relationship with China than any of the United States' Asian allies. That was not a goal of the IPS, I can tell you that. But it puts us in an awkward situation. It puts us in an awkward situation in this Asian outreach, and it's not, even that also is not entirely our fault. It has to be the fault of our news cycle. It also has to do with the fact that with what China has become. And let me say this to this forum. I think China has become increasingly focused on its own core interests, and there's been as I see it, a shift in China's general foreign policy stance from one, and economic stance, from one that since Deng Xiaoping has been towards absolute gains, that's to say, making China grow, with less attention to what that does relatively to other countries. That wasn't the main goal. The main goal for China was for China to rise. But we're seeing more recently, as been mentioned previously here, especially with, we saw this over Ukraine to some extent, and much more visibly in the last few weeks over the Middle East, a kind of repositioning of China's stance towards the West and the United States in particular, from one of absolute gains to relative gains. From absolute gains to relative gains. That is to say, it's no longer just what makes China better or stronger. Sometimes China now cares more, at least as much of what it makes its enemies weaker. And in some sense, Canada has been position. I mean, you saw, I mean, Xi Jinping treats our prime minister with visible contempt. Partly because he sees us as simply as an appendage, a water carrier for the United States, and this is partly, this occurred before the IPS, reinforced by the IPS. So I'm not sure that we have a lot of room to maneuver here, but it weakens the entire thrust of the IPS in general. And I am gratified that Xi Jinping showed up in San Francisco and at APEC, and that there is some desire for stabilization of the relationship with the United States. That's good for the world as well as good for China, but it's not really been accompanied with any change in China's general outlook towards the West. And so we're in that sense in a difficult position, and it hurts us, even though we want to be in Asia, and it hurts us particularly because we heard this morning, and I know I'm going on a little long, that, for example, our speaker from Indonesia wanted Canada to play more of a middle power role. That means we actually have to be able to play some kind of position between the United States and China. But right now we have little maneuver for that.
So I hear some gains, substantial effort, and some significant challenges. So we'll turn a little bit to a different angle to the IPS, focus more on business and on trade. And Trevor, if I could ask you, from a business council perspective, where do you see the IPS for now?
Well, thanks for the question. And I know when preparing for this, we talked about giving a letter grade for the IPS as a whole. Unfortunately, I'm not going to do that today, but I will talk a little bit about where I think Canada is doing well and maybe some areas for improvement. So maybe just preface all this with saying that, the Business Council, probably among business associations in Canada, was really quite active in pushing for an Indo-Pacific strategy, working with the government, working with our members. And so we really welcomed the strategy when it was released. I can't believe it's already been a year, but when it was released last year. And we've been an active player, I think, in some ways in supporting the strategy, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I want to start with one region where I think there's the most positivity, and that's with ASEAN, and really just Southeast Asia as a whole. Some of that, I think, is just born out of the fact that Canada wasn't terribly active in that part of the world. We've had some excellent ambassadors that we've sent to the region before. There are some Canadian businesses with a long, successful track record in that part of the world, but it's really remarkable to see how that relationship with ASEAN as an institution, but also with important member states like Indonesia, has evolved in a really short period of time. And we certainly see that from the business community. And I'd say it's really, there's a lot of interest in Canada and among our members, but also in businesses in that part of the world in Canada. And I think in large part because we just haven't had those ties historically. We really welcomed Canada becoming a strategic partner of ASEAN this year. It was really quite an honor that our president and CEO, Goldie Hyder, was invited to speak at the Indo-Pacific Forum as a part of the ASEAN Summit as a guest of the Indonesian government. I think that was an important symbol to show just how Indonesia values Canada's presence and the presence of the business community. So all very good. There are 4 trade missions to the region next year. I think I saw Sarah enter the room before, but her team at the Trade Commissioner Service will be leading the work on those. We'll participate where appropriate, but we had an excellent experience with a mission to Japan just a month ago. We're hoping that we'll conclude our bilateral deal with Indonesia next year and make progress toward the FTA. So all in all, I think ASEAN looks really good. A lot of member engagement and a lot of chances to do good things in the future. The other region that I feel very optimistic about is the North Pacific, and I know this is a priority of Minister Jolie. And she's articulated it quite well, but we certainly see this at a bilateral level with both Korea and Japan. And just last month, I was there with our CEO and with some members to attend the Canada-Korea Forum and also participate in the Team Canada Trade Mission. The relationship with both countries, I don't think has ever been as positive as it is today. It's really remarkable to see a tremendous amount of opportunity. We know they're not fast-growing economies or advanced markets like Canada, but the strategic nature of their relationship is creating a lot of opportunities for our businesses to work more closely together, to enhance economic security, and to make advancements toward the energy transition. So all very positive. Where there's room for improvement, we know that, and some of this takes time, but I heard energy come up before in a previous panel. We know how serious the energy security issue is in Northeast Asia. We hear it from the Japanese, from the business community and the government repeatedly. Korea's in the same, very similar situation. LNG Canada will be a transformational project for Canada. Assuming that most of that LNG does go to Japan, it will completely transform our trade relationship. And actually, Japan will certainly become our third largest export market, maybe even our second largest export market, depending on the volume and value of those exports. And there's a lot of interest in nuclear. There's a lot of interest in hydrogen down the road, critical minerals. So tremendous interest. The other area I think for concern, and it's not too late to address this, is between Korea and Japan. We really have to acknowledge just how far that relationship has evolved, particularly under Prime Minister Kishida and President Yoon. Both leaders deserve a lot of credit for what they've been able to do. It may regress at a certain point in time, but the future looks really bright for Korea, Japan. That's not something we've had as luxury before. And we need to think about where we can work with those countries. Just recently at APEC, Korean and Japanese businesses went together to APEC to start securing supplies of hydrogen. So we have to pay attention to these industrial collaborations and what are the implications for Canada or for Canada not being present. And then the one other thing I think we need to think about is around the Camp David trilateral work that we're seeing now between the U.S., Korea, and Japan. We could certainly be a partner to that, but we need to think more constructively of, first of all, what are the consequences of Canada not being part of those discussions? But also maybe where we can be more valuable as three of our very close partners are working together to provide security in our backyard. I think we need to think about that pretty seriously. And I'll just conclude on the two other regions, because the strategy did have 4 pillars. Just on India, there's very serious allegations, and we'll leave it to our government to investigate. We certainly support the Canadian government. But we know in talking to our government that there's still interest in sustaining our relationship at an economic level. I know it's a shared interest with the Indian government, and we'll continue, Canadian businesses, continue to invest and trade. And in the long term, we do think there will be a strong and a mutually beneficial trade and investment relationship. And finally, on China, it's we know politically a sensitive relationship, a challenging one. We fully supported then Foreign Minister, the Honourable Mark Garneau's 4 Cs, and I think that's carried over to this minister and the department. Our view has been we need to take an eyes wide open approach, and the one thing that we need to acknowledge in Canada is that all of our partners around the world, the United States, Japan, the EU, UK, Australia, really the list goes on, have restored a certain level of high-level engagement without compromising values or really compromising anything as far as we can tell. It is something to at least consider. I'm not, I know the relationship is very challenging, but Canada should always consider how its partners are engaging and whether or not there's a way to reestablish relations, at least at a ministerial level. That may be taking place now, but certainly something from an outside perspective we need to take into account. So I'll end there, no letter grade, but I think all in all, it is impressive to see the level of engagement in civil society and in government and academia. 2 major instances this year where hundreds of Canadians showed up in the region. I don't know, well, Jeff is right here, the Asia-Pacific Foundation's Canada and Asia Conference earlier this year, hundreds of Canadians showed up. Just last month, the Team Canada Trade Mission to Japan, hundreds of Canadians showed up. And I think there's going to be a lot more of this going forward, and we're happy to partner with government. So maybe I'll end there.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Trevor. And before I pass it over to Kim, if I may just reiterate a couple of things here. So the level of engagement is actually unprecedented, right? And we're seeing it. EDC is seeing it in terms of the engagement of the different parts of government, the different parts of the business community, and we're seeing it not just in words. We're actually seeing it in actions, right? The opening of the EDC office in Korea coincided with a couple of things. So the Business Council, with the Federation of Korean Businesses as well. The same week that we were in Seoul, BC Week was happening. BC Investment was showcasing Canadian innovation. The week after we left, Alberta was leading a mission on agri-food. So we're seeing a lot of action that is coordinated across the board, which from my perspective is actually the most tangible from a trade perspective, mind you, but the most tangible evidence that, that a lot of work is actually happening. The other thing that I will say that specific to South Korea that I was thoroughly impressed by is the willingness of our South Korean potential partners to partner with us. And to partner not just in terms of investment back into Canada and Canadian investment and exports into South Korea, but also conversations that talked about the broader Indo-Pacific in terms of could Canada align with like-minded other countries to drive forward our interests and their interests in the broader Indo-Pacific region. And in regard to that, when we opened up our Indonesia office also earlier this year, so these are some plugs for EDC opening up offices, because I do think that we need to lead with our presence on the ground, because that's important. That's the only way that Canada can be successful in the Indo-Pacific. But in conversations with companies of all sizes, small, medium, and large, I floated the hypothesis as to whether or not Canada could align with a third country, and who would that be, in order to drive success in Indonesia for those Canadian companies that are already there. And the unequivocal answer was actually South Korea, right? So there are potentials to think broader in terms of how Canada can win. And the reason why I say that is because the opportunity is so big that Canada doesn't need the whole pie. We need a slice off the pie. And the pie is big enough for multiple slices. So I think this is not a win and lose situation. This could very much be a win-win situation. The question is, how do we go about it, and how do we keep the momentum? And I would say that within a short period of time, of just a year after the start of the IPS, from a trade perspective, we're seeing a lot of movement, which is great. And yes, there are some hiccups along the way, and I would actually question the panelists as to whether or not that should be expected. But with that, Kim, I'll pass it over to you for your impressions 1 year into the IPS.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by thanking the organizers very much for the opportunity to be here. Let me begin by agreeing with my two academic colleagues. Lynette's view that this is a positioning paper, or was intended to be a positioning paper, I think is critical. We have to see this in a sense as partly aspirational, rather than the usual way that a government document of this sort comes out, which lays out particular objectives and means to get there. I also think that Jeremy's observation that this was an effort by the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau to align with the United States in the Indo-Pacific and away from the Asia-Pacific is correct. Although I think that there's a paradox, and Jeremy in his nice diplomatic way hinted at it, but the paradox is essentially that if you read the American Indo-Pacific strategy, and indeed if you read the Australian views on this, what you have in both of those instances are basically a geostrategic perspective on the future of their country's positioning with regard to the shaping of a geostrategic environment that is very affected affected by the return of great power conflict politics in the Indo-Pacific. If you read the IPS, the Canadian IPS, my view is that you simply do not see a geostrategic document. What you see instead, and our discussion this afternoon nicely reflects that, it's not just simply about geostrategically relocating Canada in the Indo-Pacific. It's really a kind of a foreign policy, trade policy, people-to-people policy. It's a much broader but paradoxically so broad that it's, going back to Lynette's point about a positioning paper, it creates some difficulties. Because we have, instead of being able to fix on the geostrategic element, we're in fact talking about a variety of different elements here. My remit is essentially to look at the security aspect of this, the geostrategic aspect. And we heard this morning from General Smith, I think, a nice rundown of how the Canadian government responded to the IPS and in the process of increasing our tempo, the tempo of the Canadian Armed Forces in the Indo-Pacific over the last year, the notion of redeploying naval assets to sort of be there. And it seems to me that the perspective that General Smith gave us is a nice reflection of how the Canadian government, without additional in any sense, a serious addition to our budgetary expenditures, has been able to sort of shift the chairs around so that we are more in the Pacific than we were. And that leads me to a real concern about the geostrategic aspects of our IPS. And that is that essentially, in order to be useful to allies, and in particular our senior ally, the United States, in the Indo-Pacific, we simply do not have the kind of generational shift that the IPS promises. Essentially, as General Smith nicely put it this morning, the Canadian government, in embracing the IPS, didn't give the armed forces the kind of additional resources that would be necessary to make a generational shift. We still are very much in a position where our defense policy and the billions of dollars that we spend on our defense policy is created for the kind of world that no longer exists, the kind of an American-led international order that had very much a focus to Europe. And in that sense, we're still, in a sense, being dragged by the North Atlantic anchor. And the problem, it seems to me, is that we have a particular difficulty because we are very much now in an anti-spending mood, largely a function of domestic politics in Canada. We are now in a position where governments are not going to be happy to tax and spend more in a way that would enable us to be there in the Indo-Pacific in a way that we haven't in the past. And it seems to me that that's not going to get any different anytime soon. I'm not going to give it a grade because I've retired.
Jeff, over to you. It's the foundation spans all elements, from trade, policy, even academia, as we saw in the Kayak conference. How do you see the performance of the IPS when you're in?
So first of all, I would, in the interests of full disclosure, I should say on behalf of my colleague Vina and myself that the Asia-Pacific Foundation is to be receiving resources, as one of the initiatives under the IPS to establish a physical presence in Asia and to stand up a suite of programs to be run from the region. The working plan is for the office to be in Singapore, and the idea is to build mindshare for Canada in Southeast Asia. You've all been hearing about why that's important, and also to build mindshare for Southeast Asia in Canada, equally important, because we need to listen before we talk, and that's a message that I think it's good for all people in the world to absorb. Maybe Canadians no less than anybody else. We need to listen before we talk. But so we're a part of this. That's not surprising. The foundation was created. It'll be 40 years ago. Next year, it was created by an act of parliament with a mandate to promote basically all the things that you see in the current policy. I think in terms of grades, we've faced this question before. I think the paper. I don't mind giving the paper a grade. I think the implementation, the grade will have to be an incomplete because we just don't. We're not there yet. It's only been 12 months since the strategy was announced. I think. I agree with that assessment of an A for effort. The ambition of the paper, I've been working on Canada-Asia relations as a diplomat for Canada for more than 3 decades before I left government and the Foreign Service to go to the Asia-Pacific Foundation. I have never seen anything like this in terms of its ambition. And before it, while it was being cooked up, many of us in the room were saying, don't bring forward a policy unless you have resources to back it up. And I think the people responsible listened to that, and they brought forward what I consider in the current or in the fiscal environment of a year ago when inflation was soaring. A UK government had just fallen for bringing in a tone-deaf budget. I think in that context, it's a very credible package, and I do think for all that. We should do a lot more. I think the first step to doing a lot more in life is to do more. I think I think it's a credible path. So that's a very good start, I think. You definitely can't please everybody, but it's a very good start. That said, we have taken a longer, higher level strategic lens on this. It is worth restating. We have a lot of ground to make up. We are not considered a player in the region. It pains me to say this, as I've been working on this for 3 decades, but we are not generally considered, a significant player by those in the region. We have a reputation for showing up episodically. We have a reputation for underinvesting in certain areas. And, 1 year of energy is not going to turn around that impression. But again, as others have said, so I won't go into the details, but I think a real bright spot in this is with Southeast Asia and with ASEAN, that, Canada's new intention and commitment of resources, which I think really is a very important, I think it's the biggest new thing in this IPS is as Kai Oswald said earlier today, the recognition of ASEAN centrality in looking at the entire Indo-Pacific region, and a serious commitment to step up the work in the region. Our initiative will be one part of that, but there's many other significant parts, including the new agriculture hub that hasn't been talked about much, but I think will be very important for a significant segment of the Canadian economy. So there's a recognition that we have seen already from the leaders of ASEAN who don't dole these things out casually, of an upgrading of the relationship, which is symbolically important and will have implications in the future. I think there are things to watch for. So Canada continuing its unbroken record since 1997 of not hosting APEC is a bit like we all belong to a book club and I come to your houses and you never come to my house. I think that undermines our credibility in APEC circles. APEC's not the be-all and end-all of engagement in Asia, but it is one element, and other members do step up. I think in terms of showing up, though, it is certainly one of the signal achievements of the last year. The degree of engagement at the top, the Prime Minister, but the ministers' engagement across Asia, and particularly coming and going through Southeast Asia, has been extraordinary, I think unprecedented, and we'll have to hope for that to continue. Again, to bring a level of perspective to this, This was a year in which India hosted the G20 and had a very ambitious program of like over, I think over 100 G20 related meetings for ministers and others to go to. Japan hosted the G7. In terms of showing up for APEC, the US hosted APEC, but that meant Canadian ministers could easily be present and engaged in APEC. So it was kind of a unique year in that respect. Next year, the G20 will be in Brazil and then South Africa the year after that. The G7 will be in Italy. And APEC will be in Peru. So I think the real test will be if we can keep up the frequency of ministerial engagement in the Indo-Pacific region in years when those set piece things are happening elsewhere. But up to now, I think the commitment is there, and showing up is a big part of the game.
Thanks for that, Jeff, and you very handily got us to the second part of the panel by focusing on what needs to be true in order for Canada to succeed in the year or years to come in terms of what we need to focus on, what we need to get right. And with that, maybe I'll pass it over to you, Lynette, online for your take in terms of where does Canada need to be focused on? What do we need to get right?
Sure, that's a great question. As I'm listening on the conversation, I think you have Jeff and Trevor talking about trade front, a lot of exciting things going on in Korea, Japan, and increasingly so on ASEAN as a diversification strategy, but also increase presence and assert Canada's presence in the region, which is all very important. But on other front, if we see this as a big, if we see IPS and its strategy and implementation as a big umbrella of repositioning Canada in the Indo-Pacific region, aside from trade, there are other aspects. And other aspects include, I think, security. I think to deal with China, the second largest economy, which a lot of democracies, including Canada, is dependent on to some aspect. But there's also a security dimension, which I think poses a significant threat to Canada as well as other democracies. And we can think about it in terms of the unilateral arrangement going on currently that include, the Quad and AUKUS. So the Quad is a strategic security dialogue. I mean, it's set up as a response in order to defend international rules-based order as threatened by China. I think exclusion from the Quad, I think it means that at least symbolically give people the impression that Canada has limited means of participating in security cooperation with Western allies against China. But I should also mention that our defense spending is at 1.29% of GDP. So maybe as a precondition, we need to beef up on defense before we can more meaningfully participate in security alliance. And the other security alliance is AUKUS, which is another security partnership between Australia, the UK, and the United States, focusing on nuclear-powered submarines. If it's only focus on nuclear-powered submarines, I think it's not so problematic. But there's also increasing evidence that they might use it as a segue to go into other cooperation in terms of security technology. And with that, I don't think Canada wants to be excluded, right? And of course, Canada is part of Five Eyes partnership, which has been very important in terms of providing intelligence for cracking the case of the murder of the Sikh separatist leader. So I would think, if I could give grade, I think, higher grade and a lot more exciting stuff going on the trade front. But to be meaningfully present in the Indo-Pacific, other than trade, I think security is also a very big part of it, which is why, China is seen as a threat. And in order to counter China, Canada cannot be alone, and we need to, I think, figure out a way to if I could use the term, elbow our way into some sort of security partnership. So these are the kind of the formal arrangement, but we know that aside from formal alliance and formal arrangements, there's also scope for informal type of partnership. Here I'm thinking about greater effort in terms of 1.5 track diplomacy, people-to-people exchange, student exchanges, and so on. There's, I think, a lot of opportunities exist, as Jeff has mentioned, with ASEAN. I think some money has been invested in terms of student exchanges between Canadian universities and ASEAN universities. With respect to China, I think most universities are still taking a wait-and-see approach because of the political situation in China. Things are still a little bit unstable. A lot of foreign companies and foreign investors are pulling out because the government is not sending them some sort of a mixed signal. On the one hand, the government is saying that we welcome foreign investment, but on the other hand, making raids on foreign companies, revoking visas and so on, which is mixed signals. So I think people are watching. I think in the years to come, this will be the most difficult and most challenging part, is to come up with proper implementation strategies of dealing effectively with China.
Thank you for that. Jeff, you wanted to jump in on security, I think.
Yeah, well, maybe to develop a kind of a conversation among us, just to follow up on a couple of Lynette's points. I think on the defense side, the incoming government of New Zealand has indicated its intention to see if it can join the Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which is the non-nuclear submarine part of AUKUS. And I think it's important to remember, we heard a bit earlier from General Smith and others about the cyber dimension of security. So this really is an area, not just because it's expensive and time-consuming to procure frigates and submarines and other things, but also, Canada could more practically focus on other things, but we should focus on some other things, because these are now Indo-Pacific security issues that are actually not geographically bound. And so that puts us on an equal footing and makes us equally vulnerable to everyone else in the region. It doesn't matter if you're South Korea or Australia or Canada or Iceland when it comes to being vulnerable to cyber attacks from bad actors. And this is an area where I think we can do more. No one has talked yet today, I think, at all about official development assistance, and I think that's telling that for those who think, have this idea there was a golden age, which I think those things are generally overstated, but Canada did have a certain brand in the region, and especially in Southeast Asia, decades ago, for the programming done under the Canadian International Development Agency, and the CEDA brand was well known. We have, through institutional reforms, done away with the brand, and I'm sorry to say it, as someone who spent a good deal of my career working on these things, the programs themselves also seem to be much lower profile and in political terms, in diplomatic terms, less impactful than they were when you had a relationship, at a government-to-government relationship, country-to-country relationship, where you sat down and you worked out a long-term program. What do you need? What are your highest priorities? Where can we work together? And we run our aid programs globally in a very different way today without that kind of institutional branding. It's just an ODA project from Canada. And there are many upsides to that, and I'm not here to debate that. I just point out that in the region where we still spend a lot of money on official development assistance, I think we get less credit for that diplomatically than we could. It was encouraging to see the $750 million for FinDev, Canada's Development Finance Institution, for investment in green infrastructure in Asia. I think that will help to move the needle in terms of Canada's ability to play with the big players in those markets, even though the overall sums in that sphere astronomical. But and final thing I'll mention about going forward, Canada is now taking over the chair of the Commission of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So for the next year, Canada's in the chair, and it'll be an interesting year because there are accession candidates, which include the People's Republic of China and Taiwan. And I think one area where Canada could really make a contribution is to develop some innovative and creative ideas about Taiwan and the CPTPP. I think there is space that, first of all, we should not feel bound. We should think outside the box, and the Taiwan authorities are certainly encouraging that, and they're looking to Canada to be able to play a role to say, look, it's not a question of accession yes, accession no, or accession at this time or accession at a later time. Let's think creatively about ways to have a gradual increase in engagement that could help to integrate Taiwan and its economy and its people into the CPTPP, which I think would be good for Canada and would be good for the membership of the CPTPP. Here is an opportunity, and how often do we get these days for new, creative, made in Canada, diplomatic ideas? So I would put that on the table as something that could be taken forward.
Thanks for that, Jeff. I'm mindful of time. We do want to open up for questions, but I do want to get a couple of additional views of the forward-looking next year in the IPS, maybe starting with you here to my left.
Yes,
Jeremy.
my perspective, I suppose, is slightly different from some. First of all, I think we do need to do something about targeted, focused re-engagement with China. And I would pick up from something from Jeff. If we're chairing a CPTPP, if we're talking about a roadmap for Taiwan, maybe we can talk to China about a roadmap for China. So at least to have something, to begin with something, even though you don't know where you're going to end up. That's what we need to do with China, so that we can get out of the hole we're in right now. I do want to make one more further comment that one of the things about the IPS, and to echo something that Kim said, and that the word deterrence doesn't occur in the IPS. You do a word search, there's no deterrence in it. So that's not where Canada is at in terms of that. And at the same time, the reason why we're not necessarily included in this forum is that there isn't any medium or longer term perspective in which Canada would play a significant role in the security balance in the Western Pacific. It's just not there. So that anything premised on that is not going to happen. On the other hand, the thing is, and this is where I really want to echo something I had before, part of the reason why our ASEAN outreach, ASEAN in some sense was the default in terms of trying to re-engage the Pacific when we were trying to exclude China. I know it's, but that has elevated ASEAN from being a bridesmaid to a bride. And I guess the answer to that is we've got to keep that up. And that we will probably get appreciation in turn if we stop treating ASEAN as the bridesmaid and keep on the effort. And that has opportunities, and that actually then creates certain kind of leverage, given that we're not going to affect the balance of power. And that ASEAN is looking for some hedging and middle power role. Maybe these are the places to go, and I'll stop here.
So I'll pick up where you left off in terms of ASEAN and the opportunity that ASEAN presents for Canada, both from a geopolitical positioning perspective as well as from a trade perspective. If we really think about where growth is going to be, we cannot we can, like ASEAN has to be at the center of the focus, right? Needs to be the center of the focus of our Indo-Pacific strategy, and considering the diversification that some, not just Canada, but some other economies actually need to think about in terms of their own exposure within Indo-Pac, even those more towards the north of Asia, right? Indo-Pac is going to continue to play, ASEAN is going to continue to play a fundamental role in terms of center of growth. And with that, maybe, Trevor, from a business perspective, where do you see things for the next year or two?
Well, actually, first, I just wanted to comment briefly on something you mentioned about ASEAN before and the opportunities. So it's something Canada should really think about, including in upcoming trade missions, for instance, how we can look at the success of countries like South Korea and Japan in Southeast Asian markets. I was recently made aware of that same visit. I know you were there in Korea, just how significant Korea's footprint is in a country like Vietnam, and how successful they've been. And you know, certainly it's a lesson for Canada, and it's also an opportunity to collaborate with one of our key partners in the region. But just in terms of looking forward, I'll be very brief because I know we are running out of time. I think it's very important, as Jeff noted, to have the continued high-level engagement, not just this year, but last year. There were a lot of global summits that drove ministers to the region, our Prime Minister and businesses and others. Next year, we have to be intentional. And so we're going to have to choose where we go. I know there's plans to bring trade missions and others, but we need to think about that. We'd also say it's important to work with stakeholders, that we don't lose focus in the region. And finally, probably the biggest contribution we can make to peace and security in the region is getting our resources to market. We know the interest is there. We need the trade enabling infrastructure and the regulatory predictability and certainty to do that. But if Canada really wants to make a contribution to peace in the Indo-Pacific and stability, we will get our energy, our food, and other natural resources there as quickly as we can. Maybe I'll end with that.
No, thanks, Trevor. Kim, maybe the last words to you.
Thank you.
Before
let
you go, though,
let me follow up on something that Lynette proposed, and that is that we've really, in the short and medium term, we need to abandon our general approach, an approach that former principal of the Royal Military College of Canada, Joel Sokolsky, nicely characterized the Canadian approach to defense spending. He reminded us that we weren't really free riders in defense. Instead, we were easy riders in the sense that we spend as little as we can get away with. And up to this point, the government has not, in any sense, tried to persuade Canadians that they need to abandon their easy riding habits. And it seems to me that as we look even just in the shorter term of what to do in the Indo-Pacific, you mentioned the importance of being there. Well, just simply think about how we move our officials to be there in the Asia Pacific. To me, it's amazing that we, as a very rich G7 country, insist that if we need officials to get across the Pacific, we send them by commercial flight. We don't ever think about the possibility of actually spending money to provide officials, including ministers, with an easier and more effective and efficient way of moving across the Pacific. So if I had a recommendation, it would be to begin to recognize that in order for the IPS to be successful, we actually have to start spending money, and we have to start abandoning our easy riding, not free riding, our easy riding approach. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. So we're going to open up the panel for questions. So if there's any questions in the audience, please get close to the mics and do let us know who the question is for. Please.
Hi, I'm Sean Narayan from St. Thomas University. I'm going to disagree a little bit with my colleagues on the panel. If I was going to grade the paper, I'd probably give it a D. That's mostly because I don't like giving out Fs. So a D sends the message of not being too painful. I guess I'm questioning something which I think we all need to be thinking about, which is, I think, maybe the central premise that we seem to be proceeding from, which is, are we constructing an enemy out of China? Like, we're certainly treating it like one. And are we, in fact, making something that doesn't have to actually be that case. Getting back to Jeremy's point about China pursuing absolute gains right now, well, I think you might be right, but I mean, China is being targeted by the U.S. There's no question about it. You know, it's trade, technology, everything else. The Americans are out to make sure that China will not be an effective competitor in economic or technological terms. That's obvious. And we're basically lining up behind this aggression. And I mean, you know, the document uses the term China as a disruptive power. Now, if China was 10% as disruptive to the world as the U.S., we'd have a problem. But China doesn't have anything like, say, the invasion of Iraq and the millions of people who have died in the wars that have followed on its record. So what exactly has China done that makes it such a threat to us? And is it the threat, is this threat manageable through diplomacy? Or is it really something that we have to be circling the wagons and allying, lining up behind our senior allies without ever questioning what exactly is it that our senior allies are doing and why are they doing it? You know, the basic problem we have is that we're status quo powers. We've done very well in a world for a few centuries now by the fact that we're on top and we're able to exploit everybody else. And now the problem is that a non-status quo power is emerging. And rather than coming up with a way to accommodate it, we're trying to find some way to contain it. And we should be asking ourselves, why are we doing that? Before we go down a rather unnecessary road. And that was a comment, obviously. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe we'll pass over here and take a few.
Sure, thank you. My name is Claire Cito. So my question is on measuring progress. We heard Merit Lavery speak about our competitive position, and the strategy was launched last year. We are already looking at activities next year and the coming years. How do we measure our progress and what's the return on investment? And how do we measure our progress for businesses, I mean, particularly, and that of our competitors? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, one more question and then we'll.
All right. Thank you. Hi, my name is Bill. I work with the Privy Council Office. I'm also a member of the Asia-Pacific Foundation's Canada-Asia Young Professionals Fellowship Program. So my question is mostly for Jeff, but other people as well. So as you and other people here today have mentioned, Canada is not considered a significant player in the region. So in your opinion, to what extent has the Indo-Pacific strategy impacted this perception in the region? And what can or should Canada do to gain greater credibility? Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. So with that, I'll talk to really quick how we measure progress. So for me, it is actually quite simple. The Indo-Pacific strategy is a long-term strategy. We're used to measuring progress on a quarterly basis. I don't think that can apply for the Indo-Pacific strategy and for Canada's success in the Indo-Pacific. It is about making tangible progress as it relates to laying the foundations so that Canada, from a trade perspective, at least because that's where the question came from, can show gigains. How are we doing that? Well, from a policy perspective, there's advances made in terms of upgrading our relations with ASEAN and South Korea and other countries. And from a business perspective, and this is where EDC comes in, we need to be part of the solution, leading the way, putting ourselves on the ground so that we can help Canadian companies grow and succeed in the region. Now that will take time. Merit actually talked about leading with a large segment, and I think that is a fair point, and it applies specifically for the Indo-Pacific, because the cultural differences, the way of doing business differences, etc., are actually quite significant. But large businesses tend to be more mature in terms of how to deal with those differences and have the resources in order to invest over the long term to be successful. they will then bring along their supply chains. So conversations that we're having here in Canada is how can, for example, EDC engage with a supply chain of large businesses that have an interest to go into the Indo-Pacific in order to equip them so that they can come along. Because this is, once again, it's a win-win. In conversations with large businesses in Canada, coming out of COVID, supply chain disruptions have been an issue and continue to be an issue. And when asked, as you go international, would you like to bring your supply chain with you? The short answer is yes, we've traded with them, we know them. If they could come along, of course, that would be our first choice. So that is one way. In terms of how we measure that is, from our perspective, is the business activity of Canadians in the region. And I'll talk a little bit about Canadian investors. Right? So how the Canadian investors have actually been quite successful in parts of the Indo-Pacific, if we think about the Canadian pension plans, et cetera. How were they, like how did they measure that? It's just by the sheer business activity that they've actually been able to create in the region. And now it's for us to actually continue to build on that first success, to start to see more of a trade ecosystem built in the Indo-Pacific. The activity will be quite obvious. Maybe Jeff, I'll pass it over to you for the second question.
So the second question wasn't my idea, but you know, I think we have been talking about, you know, what Canada can do. I will take the opportunity to say we have another conference coming up. So we did this thing last February, the first Canada and Asia conference, with over 500 people, just over half of them from around Asia, and we had 240 who came out from Canada, and we had universities from across Canada inviting their graduates from all over Asia. This is a great force multiplier for Canada. We're doing we're doing this again in February coming up, this coming February, in 3 months from now, a 2-day conference focused on agri-food and food security, and a 2-day conference focused on climate solutions. And I've got a bunch of these postcards with a QR code at my table there. Happy to share those with you. And I think that's the kind of thing, and we do this with the benefit of support from the federal government, also from provincial governments, from business sponsors, from the universities contributing financially and in kind, and from partners in the region. And that's the kind of thing that we need to keep doing. Canadians need to keep showing up. Our own polling that has been done with support from EDC and from the federal government of business leaders in Southeast Asia over the last few years has indicated that they're very open to the idea of doing more business with Canada. Why are they not doing it? It's because they are not familiar with Canada and Canadians. That's great news. That's an addressable problem. I think it will be important, you know, we've been talking about elections. One thing, I think it's really important to say, if Canada is to succeed in a 5 or 10 year plan, and this is something that has been building, you know, before the Indo-Pacific strategy of the government. We were seeing it because we sit at the Asia-Pacific Foundation at this intersection. We're independent from government, but our funding is derived primarily from public sources. That business was already going to Southeast Asia, opening offices, doing missions and so on. Universities were already expanding their relationships in Southeast Asia. The institutional investors from Canada, the pension funds and so on, were already going there. And this is not by any means a knock on the federal government for coming out with an IPS. It shows how aligned that was with where there was already organic movement, and this gives an opportunity for an accelerator. But I think in a long-term perspective, it'll be important politically if there's a prospect of a change of government in a couple of years, and that's always a possibility in any democracy. It sure would be nice if those who might come into government, and we're a nonpartisan independent foundation. So I say this would apply to any party in whatever parliament you have, is for a potentially incoming government, unless they're opposed to this thrust to have a longer term investment and engagement by Canada in the Indo-Pacific region. And if they are, that's fine, you know, that's a policy debate, that's what a democracy is all about. But if you were thinking about coming into government and you thought this was generally something you didn't want to torpedo, it sure would be good to send some positive signals to the rest of the world. This happens in other democracies on key policy engagements. We have had a tradition in the past in Canada of this happening, for instance, on free trade, really critical free trade negotiations at certain times. Not always. Again, that's what a democracy is for. But I think, that in terms of our credibility going forward, if you think about the credibility of the U.S. and how it is suffering right now from the prospect of a pivot of some kind or a dramatic change in foreign policy, just think about, for partners of Canada, how that might look. So I think that's an important thing. We'd really like to see foreign policy being debated more in domestic circles in Canada because we finally got the attention of some interlocutors in some parts of the Indo-Pacific region. And now that they're paying attention, I think, we need to put our best foot forward.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Unfortunately, I wish we could continue the conversation, very, very engaged conversation. We've run out of time. So with that, please join me in a round of applause for our panelists this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Sven. We'll move immediately to the next panel. If I could ask the ambassadors, Your Excellencies, to please come and join us on the stage. And on Jeff's last point,